Elaine Stewart died the way Hollywood taught her to live, quietly, beautifully, and alone. October 27, 2011. A modest apartment in Beverly Hills. The afternoon light filtered weakly through thin curtains, casting shadows across a room filled with antique mirrors, dozens of them, each reflecting a woman who had become invisible long before she died. Elsie Henrietta Maria Steinberg, the woman the world knew as Elaine Stewart, took her final breath at 82. Alone except for the ghosts of beauty haunting those glass surfaces. There was no fanfare, no breaking news, no tribute montages. The woman who had graced Life magazine's cover, whose face had been immortalized in Technicolor alongside Hollywood's greatest stars, passed away in near-complete silence. A few brief obituaries appeared, reducing her life to film credits and a death date. Most got the details wrong. They always had. The official cause was natural causes. But those who knew her story understood that Elaine Stewart had been dying slowly for decades, disappearing frame by frame from an industry that had once promised her everything. Her death was merely the final fade to black in a tragedy that began the moment MGM discovered her face and decided that was all she would ever need to be. She didn't die forgotten. She died exactly the way Hollywood taught her to, quietly, beautifully, and alone. Days after her death, an old photograph resurfaced online. Black and white, Elaine in silk, her legendary beauty at its peak, but her head turned toward a window, caught in profound melancholy. Life magazine had called it the loneliest photo of Hollywood in 1954. Looking at it now, the image felt less like a photograph and more like a prophecy. What happened to Elaine Stewart? How does a woman who embodied Hollywood's golden age, who stood alongside Lana Turner and Gene Kelly, vanish so completely that her death barely registers as news? Why did she walk away at the height of her beauty? What was in those rumored diaries her family allegedly destroyed? And perhaps most haunting, was the quiet ending a choice, or the inevitable conclusion to a story Hollywood had written for her the day they asked her to change her name? But to understand how it all ended, we must first understand how it all began. The year was 1929. Montclair, New Jersey, a comfortable middle-class suburb where the American dream still seemed within reach. Elsie Henrietta Maria Steinberg entered the world as the daughter of Jewish immigrants who had built a modest life through hard work. They had hopes for their daughter that likely didn't include Hollywood. From her earliest years, Elsie was different. There was something in how she carried herself, a natural grace that seemed at odds with childhood. By 12, she had grown into her features in a way that made people turn their heads. It wasn't just prettiness. Elsie possessed that elusive quality cameras love. Bone structure creating perfect shadows and light, eyes that changed color, a face that could shift from innocent to knowing in a glance. But beauty in a working-class Jewish household in 1940s America was not the blessing movies made it seem. Elsie's mother viewed her daughter's looks with pride and worry. She had seen what happened to beautiful girls who believed their faces were passports to better lives. So she tried to make her daughter practical, to teach her that beauty fades but character endures. Elsie learned those lessons well. She became an avid reader, drawn to books exploring darker human nature. While other girls read romance, Elsie gravitated toward melancholic poetry. She collected quotes, filled notebooks with observations. One teenage entry read, "Everyone sees my face, no one sees me." Could their early childhood experiences have laid the foundation for later triumphs or tragedies? In Elsie's case, devastatingly clear. She learned early that beauty created a prison, that being looked at was not the same as being seen. This understanding would become the central tragedy of her Hollywood career, the wound that never healed. When she graduated in 1947, the world was changing. America was booming, and with it came an explosion of mass media. Hollywood churned out films at unprecedented rates. Demand for fresh faces, particularly beautiful ones, seemed insatiable. Elsie had enrolled in college to study literature, but fate had other plans. It started with a modeling job. A photographer friend needed someone for a commercial. Elsie agreed, thinking it would be one-time money for textbooks. But those photographs made their way to a New York agency. Within weeks, she was being courted, promised steady work, asked to leave school. Her parents were horrified. Her mother begged her to finish her education. But Elsie, at 18, made the decision that would determine her life's arc. She said yes. New York in the late 1940s was a different education. Elsie Steinberg became Elaine Stewart, a name that sounded less Jewish, more palatable. It was the first compromise, the first erasure. She told herself names didn't matter. But years later, she would write, "They took my name before they took anything else. I should have known then what was coming." The modeling work came easily, too easily. She appeared in advertisements for soap, cigarettes, perfume, her face selling products while she lived in a cramped Queens apartment. The money was good, but the work was hollow. Stand here, turn, smile, don't smile, be whatever we need you to be as long as you stay beautiful. Was the success they achieved truly worth all the pain they endured? While other models spent evenings at clubs, Elaine went home to read Kierkegaard and Sylvia Plath. She began collecting old mirrors, drawn to how antique glass distorted reflections made beauty strange. "Old mirrors reflect more truth than new ones," she told a journalist years later. It was one of the few honest things she ever said in an interview. Success came knocking in 1952, wrapped in Hollywood glamour. MGM had seen her photographs. They wanted to test her for films. They promised stardom, careful cultivation, a chance to become the next great Hollywood beauty. It was everything a model could want. It was a trap disguised as opportunity. The screen test was magic. The camera didn't just like her, it loved her. Her bone structure created shadows, giving depth to basic shots. Her eyes conveyed emotions she didn't know she could show. The footage made its way to Louis B. Mayer, who reportedly watched it 3 times before declaring, "Sign her, now." The contract arrived with conditions. She would relocate to Los Angeles immediately. Exclusive contract for 7 years. She would attend their classes, go where they sent her, wear what they chose, date who they approved. And one more thing. Change her last name. Steinberg was too Jewish. It would limit her appeal. They suggested Stewart, strong, all-American, easy to pronounce. Elaine signed. What choice did she have? This was MGM, the studio of Garbo and Gable. But late that night, alone in her Queens apartment, she looked in one of her antique mirrors and barely recognized the woman staring back. The name change had severed her last connection to the girl she had been. The train ride to Los Angeles took 3 days. Elaine spent most of it watching America roll past, farms and towns, mountains and deserts. She brought a suitcase of clothes and a bag full of books she would never have time to read again. Hollywood welcomed her with manufactured enthusiasm. MGM arranged photographers at Union Station. Newspapers ran breathless captions. "New star arrives." She looked radiant, smiling wide, waving. No one could see the exhaustion behind her eyes, the trembling hand holding her suitcase. The studio system was a machine manufacturing stars according to strict specifications. Elaine was enrolled in finishing school, acting classes, voice coaching, dance, deportment, personality management. She was taught how to walk for cameras, maximize her angles, laugh on cue, cry on cue, exist on cue. But something set Elaine apart. Not just beauty. Hollywood was full of beautiful people. It was a quality of stillness, contained depth. When on screen, she commanded attention through presence. She could stand perfectly still and make you unable to look away. One casting director called it the kind of face that makes men want to solve her mysteries. He meant it as a compliment. It was a warning. Her first role came quickly. The Bad and the Beautiful in 1952, a film about Hollywood's dark underbelly. The irony was not lost on Elaine. She played a starlet, beautiful and ultimately discarded. She had few lines, but critics noticed. "Watch for Elaine Stewart," one review predicted. "She has the kind of beauty that could launch 1,000 films." What they didn't predict was that she would barely make a dozen. MGM began casting her in more prominent roles, always the same type: the beautiful woman, the temptress, the love interest defined by appearance. In A Slight Case of Larceny in 1953, she played a gorgeous distraction. In Brigadoon in 1954, she was decoration in Scottish village scenes. The pattern established itself. Elaine Stewart was becoming a commodity, perfect angles and careful lighting rather than an actress. Behind the scenes, Elaine struggled. She attended acting classes on her own time, studied Stanislavski, read plays, watched foreign films. But every time she discussed wanting more challenging roles, she received the same response: "We know what's best. Trust us. Your job is to look beautiful." The social scene was suffocating. MGM arranged publicity dates with appropriate male stars. She attended premieres with men she barely knew, smiled at nightclubs she hated, made small talk at parties where everyone performed and no one was real. While other starlets thrived, Elaine found it exhausting. She began declining invitations, staying home with her books. This didn't sit well with the studio. Stars were supposed to be seen, generate buzz. Elaine's reluctance was noted in her file. Difficult was the word, though all she wanted was solitude when cameras weren't rolling. Lana Turner described her as the beauty who made producers fall silent, but also someone who seemed to be mourning something she'd lost before she ever arrived. Behind all that glamour was there an unbearable loneliness that nobody saw. On screen, Elaine Stewart was the embodiment of 1950s glamour. Perfectly coiffed, immaculately dressed, unattainable beauty. Off-screen, she was drowning in the very thing everyone praised. In letters to her college friend, she wrote, "I played the woman they wanted, but I've never been allowed to be myself. Every time the lights went out, I wondered if that was the last time. You can't act your way out of the way men look at you." A Brigadoon should have been her breakthrough. A major MGM musical directed by Vincente Minnelli, starring Gene Kelly. Elaine threw herself into the work, rehearsing until her feet bled. For the first time since arriving, she felt like she was actually acting, not just being looked at. Rumors about her and Minnelli started, whispered suggestions of an affair. Whether true remains speculation. What's certain is that Minnelli recognized something beyond her beauty. He shot her differently, capturing vulnerability and genuine emotion rather than just her profile. He worked with her patiently, drawing out performances that hinted at the actress she might have become. But when Brigadoon was released, reviews for Elaine were mixed. Critics praised her beauty but questioned her acting. They didn't notice she'd been given almost nothing to work with, that her character existed primarily as Highland scenery decoration. The message from MGM was clear. Beauty was her role, not acting. The breaking point came in 1955. The studio wanted to loan her for The 7-Year Itch, the Billy Wilder comedy that would make Marilyn Monroe an icon. Elaine read the script and felt something rebel. She told her agent she didn't want to do it. She felt the role existed only to display her body. She wanted substance, depth. She wanted to be taken seriously. MGM's response was swift and brutal. If she wouldn't take offered roles, they would stop offering. The studio had dozens of beautiful young women, all eager for opportunities Elaine was rejecting. Her refusal was seen not as artistic integrity, but as ingratitude. The unofficial blacklist began. Casting directors stopped calling, her agents stopped fighting. She watched roles go to other actresses. Did this tragic event mark their downfall? Or was it simply the tipping point of deeper problems? Both. Elaine's refusals were the public break, but the foundation had been crumbling for years. Hollywood in the 1950s had no template for a beautiful woman who wanted to be taken seriously. The industry ran on compliance. Elaine's resistance was betrayal. In 1956, the final nail came with her refusal to audition for Baby Doll, Elia Kazan's controversial film. Her manager begged her. It was Kazan, one of the most respected directors. This could rehabilitate her career. Elaine refused, not because of nudity. She had done plenty of negligee scenes. She refused because she read the script and saw the same story. A beautiful woman whose beauty is her curse, whose body is the plot, whose humanity is secondary. "I'd rather disappear," she told her agent, "than spend the rest of my life playing versions of the same woman until everyone forgets I was ever anything else." The studio let her contract expire in 1957. No fanfare, no mutual agreement, just quiet termination. She was 28, still stunning, still capable of stopping traffic. But in Hollywood years, especially for women, she might as well have been ancient. And worse, she had earned a reputation as difficult, stubborn, ungrateful, in Hollywood, synonymous with unemployable. The cameras stopped calling. The silence was louder than any applause she'd ever received. What followed was a different tragedy, the slow fade rather than dramatic crash. Elaine didn't die young like Monroe or spiral into addiction. Instead, she experienced something Hollywood rarely acknowledges. She became irrelevant. Not all at once, but gradually, role by role, year by year. She made a few more films in the late 1950s, B-movies mostly, westerns and crime dramas where she looked beautiful in frontier dresses. Night Passage in 1957 with James Stewart was her last significant film role. Reviews barely mentioned her. When they did, Elaine Stewart is beautiful as always, and nothing more. By 1960, she had transitioned to television, game shows, and variety programs. She smiled, bantered with hosts, wore elegant dresses. To viewers, she probably seemed successful. But anyone who knew the industry understood what television appearances meant for a former contract player. The end of the line. The contrast between her public image and private reality became grotesque. Magazine profiles described her living glamorously. The truth was far more mundane and painful. She lived alone in an increasingly cramped Burbank apartment, the glamorous West Hollywood place long since traded for something affordable. She did her own grocery shopping, washed dishes, lived a life completely recognizable to any single working woman, except that a few years earlier she had been photographed with Elizabeth Taylor. Can anyone ever truly escape from the shadow of their darkest moments? For Elaine, the darkest moment wasn't scandal or tragedy in the conventional sense. It was the slow realization that she had been right. Hollywood had only ever wanted her face. And now that there were younger faces, she was simply no longer needed. In 1963, something unexpected happened. Elaine met someone. Not a director or producer, but a businessman from outside the industry entirely. He knew who Elaine Stewart was, had seen her films, but was more interested in Elsie Steinberg, the woman who collected old mirrors and read Kierkegaard. They married quietly in 1964, a small ceremony with no Hollywood guests. The marriage offered something Elaine had never found in Hollywood, a chance to be ordinary. She retired completely from acting, making no announcements, simply stopping. The phone calls had slowed to a trickle anyway. She moved to a suburban neighborhood far from the Hollywood hills. She became a mother, had children, lived a life that looked nothing like what MGM had promised 15 years earlier. The spotlights were gone, but in the quiet kitchen of her suburban home, the soft glow of a lamp became enough. For some, this might have felt like defeat. For Elaine, it was salvation. She had lost the world's gaze but gained the peace of not being looked at. She never spoke about Hollywood with her children. They grew up knowing their mother had been an actress, but it wasn't something she discussed. Old films would occasionally air on television, and her kids would watch, fascinated, seeing their mother young and beautiful and frozen in Technicolor. But when they asked, she would change the subject. Were these final decisions acts of surrender, or courageous acts of self-preservation? The evidence suggests the latter. Unlike so many contemporaries who stayed in Hollywood, chasing younger roles, accepting smaller parts, desperately clinging to relevance, Elaine chose differently. She chose invisibility over indignity. She chose a real life over a performance. And in 1960s America, when women were still primarily defined by beauty and marriage, this was radical, even if it looked conventional, but the mirrors remained. Throughout various homes over the years, Elaine continued collecting antique mirrors. They were a reminder, not of her beauty, which was fading naturally, but of her belief that old glass reflects more truth than new. They were a daily confrontation with the woman she had been and become, a private reckoning she engaged in every time she caught her reflection in their wavy, imperfect surfaces. The 1970s and 80s passed quietly for Elaine. She watched from a distance as Hollywood changed, as the studio system that had crushed her finally collapsed. Sometimes she saw glimmers of progress, women writing and directing, actresses celebrated for talent rather than just beauty. Other times it seemed like nothing had changed at all. She gave no interviews during these decades. When film historians or journalists tracked her down, hoping for reminiscences about the golden age, she politely declined. "I have nothing to say about that time. I'm not that person anymore." Some interpreted this as bitterness. It was self-protection. Elaine had learned that the only way to survive Hollywood was to leave it completely behind. By the early 2000s, renewed interest in 1950s Hollywood emerged. Film scholars began rediscovering forgotten actors and actresses. Elaine Stewart's name came up occasionally in these retrospectives, usually as a footnote, an example of beauty that never quite translated to stardom. But a few writers dug deeper, finding her old letters, piecing together the story of a woman who had resisted the system and paid the price. Forgotten stars of MGM exhibitions began appearing in Los Angeles museums. Elaine's face appeared among them, that famous Life magazine photo, the loneliest photo of Hollywood, prominently displayed. Gallery visitors would stop in front of it, struck by the sadness in Elaine's eyes, by the way beauty and melancholy could coexist so perfectly. In the museum lights, her face stared back from the photograph, still beautiful, still unreachable. The audience saw art. She had seen a warning. Elaine never attended any of these exhibitions. By then, she was in her late 70s and 80s, her health declining, her world shrinking to the comfortable confines of her Beverly Hills apartment, modest by Hollywood standards. Her husband had passed away. Her children had families of their own. She lived alone, surrounded by those antique mirrors and shelves of books she'd finally had time to read. The few people who saw her in those final years say she seemed at peace but also resigned. She had lived long enough to see the full arc, the bright ascent, the brutal rejection, the long fade into obscurity. She had outlived most of her MGM contemporaries, watched as their obituaries appeared, remembering women who had stayed in the game longer but often at great personal cost. On October 27, 2011, Elaine Stewart died quietly in that modest apartment, surrounded by her mirrors and books, the artifacts of a life split between two irreconcilable halves, the public performance and the private truth. She was 82. Her death certificate listed natural causes. The obituaries were brief and often inaccurate, reducing her life to film credits and faded beauty. There was no big funeral, no Hollywood memorial, no parade of celebrities. Her children arranged a private ceremony for family only. It was the ending she would have wanted. Quiet, private, free from performance. Was their death as straightforward as reported? Or were powerful hidden forces involved? In Elaine's case, there was no conspiracy, no suspicious circumstances. Her death was exactly what it appeared to be. An old woman dying naturally. But that straightforward ending shouldn't obscure the real tragedy, which wasn't in how she died, but in how she disappeared long before death claimed her. The tragedy of Elaine Stewart is the tragedy of erasure, of being reduced to a single dimension, beauty, and then discarded when that dimension no longer generated profit. She was erased first by the studio system, which changed her name and asked her to be nothing more than a face. She was erased again when she resisted and was punished with irrelevance. And she was erased finally by history itself, by an industry and culture that couldn't fit her into its preferred narratives of either triumph or tragic downfall. Because Elaine's story is neither. She didn't triumph. She made fewer than a dozen significant films and was forgotten within a decade. But she didn't have a tragic downfall either. No overdose, no suicide, no scandal-filled decline. Instead, she experienced something Hollywood narratives rarely account for. She simply faded away, her beauty and her refusal to compromise both insufficient to sustain a career in an industry that wanted compliance more than artistry. The rumored diaries add another layer. Multiple sources suggest she kept detailed journals throughout her Hollywood years. Honest, unflinching accounts of life at MGM, the men who used their power, the compromises she was asked to make. If these diaries existed, they could have been revelatory. But according to these sources, the diaries were destroyed after her death. Her family, wanting to protect her privacy and perhaps their own, allegedly burned them without making the contents public. If true, this represents another erasure, a final silencing of a woman who spent most of her life trying to be heard beyond her appearance. What was in those diaries? We can only speculate, perhaps details about powerful men who made unwanted advances, perhaps honest assessments of fellow actors, perhaps philosophical musings about beauty and worth, identity and performance, perhaps simply daily observations of a woman navigating an industry designed to use her up and throw her away. Or perhaps the diaries never existed at all, and the rumors are themselves mythology. In the years since her death, interest in Elaine Stewart has slowly grown among classic film enthusiasts and feminist film scholars. She has become a symbol, not of glamour or stardom, but of the costs of resistance within an oppressive system. Graduate students write theses about her career, analyzing her few interviews, the pattern of her choices, the meaning in her refusals. She has become more studied in death than she ever was celebrated in life. Forgotten Stars exhibitions continue to feature her photograph, that haunting image of loneliness and beauty. Film festivals occasionally screen The Bad and the Beautiful, or Brigadoon, and younger audiences discover her face, marvel at her beauty, and ask, why didn't she become a bigger star? The answer, when you dig into her story, is devastatingly simple. She wasn't willing to pay the price they were willing to pay. She drew lines, set boundaries, said no when the industry demanded yes. And Hollywood in the 1950s had no use for beautiful women who said no. Her legacy is complicated and incomplete, like the woman herself. She is not celebrated as a great actress. She never got those roles. She is not remembered as a tragic figure in the classical sense. No premature death, no scandal. Instead, she occupies a strange middle ground, acknowledged but not celebrated, remembered but not honored, visible in retrospectives but absent from the canon. Perhaps this is fitting. Perhaps Elaine Stewart's legacy is precisely this state of partial visibility, of being present but not prominent, remembered but not fully known. It mirrors her own life, her own experience of being seen constantly but understood rarely, of having her face everywhere but herself nowhere. "Hollywood didn't break me," she said once. "It simply forgot I ever existed. The statement is haunting in its accuracy. The industry didn't destroy Elaine Stewart through abuse or scandal. It destroyed her through something more insidious: indifference. Once she stopped being useful, once her beauty was no longer enough to compensate for her unwillingness to compromise, she simply ceased to exist in Hollywood's eyes. And in an industry built on visibility, this forgetting was its own form of violence. Today, when we look at that photograph, the loneliest photo of Hollywood, we should see more than just a beautiful woman in silk. We should see a system that took a young woman from New Jersey, stripped her of her name and agency, used her beauty until she refused to be reduced to it, and then discarded her so completely that her death barely registered as news. We should see the cost of saying no, the price of dignity, the way Hollywood promises everything and delivers nothing to those who won't perform exactly as directed. We should see Elaine Stewart, née Elsie Henrietta Maria Steinberg, in all her complexity, not as a footnote to Hollywood's golden age, but as a main character in its ongoing tragedy. A woman who was more than her beauty but was never allowed to prove it. A woman who chose invisibility over exploitation and spent the rest of her life wondering if she'd made the right choice. A woman who collected old mirrors because they reflected more truth than new ones, who filled notebooks with observations nobody would read, who died alone with all her wisdom unshared and most of her story untold. Elaine Stewart knew better. She knew beauty was never enough. And in the end, that knowledge saved her, even if it couldn't make anyone remember her name. The last mirror caught only the light from the window. No reflection, no face, just the echo of something that had once been luminous. What hidden secrets might still remain untold behind their public image? For Elaine, the secrets were not scandalous but sad. The compromises she refused, the dreams she abandoned, the life she might have had if Hollywood had wanted more from her than just her face. The letters she wrote and no one saved, the diaries she may have kept and someone destroyed, the wisdom she accumulated and took with her to the grave. Can beauty ever be freedom when the world insists it must be your prison? The greatest tragedy of Elaine Stewart is not that she died forgotten. It's that she lived forgotten, spending decades as a living ghost, a beautiful woman who had been erased so thoroughly that when she finally died, it felt less like an ending and more like a belated acknowledgement of a disappearance that had happened decades before. She deserved better. They all did. All those women whose beauty made them valuable until it didn't, whose talent was never tested because their faces were too distracting, whose stories ended in silence because Hollywood had stopped listening long before they stopped speaking. "I never thought beauty could be a trap," she said, "until it was all they wanted from me." She spent her life trying to be more. Hollywood spent her life ensuring she never could be. And when she died, quietly and alone with her antique mirrors, Hollywood didn't even notice she was gone. That, in the end, is the real tragedy. Not her death, but her life. Not how she ended, but how she was never truly allowed to begin.